Hello and welcome to your favorite crossover podcast, Army of Crime. I am your host, Matt, and I'm here with my second host, Dustin. Dustin, say hello to the people.
Bonjour.
So this episode, we are looking at the movie Coraline and the French comic Flight of the Raven.
I believe that's accurate, yes.
Yes. For today's annoying pre-show banter, I'm going to ask you what the most bizarre movie ever made was, and then I'm going to give you the correct answer.
Oh boy, the most bizarre movie ever made. I'm going to propose perhaps the Czech art film Sweet Movie, which contains a lot of bizarre surrealist adventures. Though in terms of mainstream studio films, I might suggest Orson Welles' The Lady from Shanghai.
Okay. The correct answer is B movie, starring Jerry Seinfeld.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I missed that.
Yeah. It's a movie where a small bee played by Jerry Seinfeld is in a romantic relationship with an adult woman played by Renee Zellweger.
Have you seen this movie?
Have I seen the movies that you talked about? No, but I have seen B movie.
Okay.
There's a part where Jerry Seinfeld, as a bee, cross-examines Ray Liotta, played by himself, in a court case.
Is Jerry Seinfeld the bee lawyer?
I guess.
Okay, it doesn't sound like you paid close attention to the plot.
I mean, it doesn't really explain it all that much. I think they're both lawyers. His friend is played by Matthew Broderick. I think they're both lawyers. And then Jerry Seinfeld says, in reference to Ray Liotta, "That's not a good fella. That's a bad fella."
I get it. That's a little reference to
this
film
is in a
he was
movie that cost millions of dollars to make, and Jerry Seinfeld plays a bee. So I'll just leave that with you.
Okay. Yeah.
So the first thing we're looking at is a movie. It's also an animated movie. It does not have Jerry Seinfeld in it.
Which is the movie to its detriment.
Certainly. This is the movie Coraline, and if I were to ask some person on the street who directed the movie Nightmare Before Christmas, what do you think that they would say, assuming they didn't say, "Leave me alone, you deranged weirdo"? What would they probably say?
Like Wes Craven, because they get it confused with Nightmare on Elm Street.
Okay, if they didn't say that, what else would they say?
Oh boy.
What I'm going for here is that a lot of people, I believe, I know I've corrected people before, not like in a jerky way, but they think that Nightmare Before Christmas is directed by Tim Burton. Because we kind of think of it as like a Tim Burton property, but it is not. It is directed by Henry Selick, who has made several claymation movies. So he made Nightmare Before Christmas. He also made James and the Giant Peach. And then he made our film Coraline, which is, of course, an adaptation of a Neil Gaiman written short novel, which was also adapted into a comic.
Didn't Tim Burton produce Nightmare Before Christmas?
Right. He's the producer and sort of the concept guy who came up with the idea, but Henry Selick is the claymation director.
Okay.
I mean, he's the director, is what I'm saying. He's not like there's two directors. He's the director, and he's also very good at claymation.
Okay, I hear you. So what is this Coraline about then?
So as I mentioned, it's an adaptation of a short novel, which was also adapted into a comic book written by Neil Gaiman. And it is sort of like Stephen King's It meets Alice in Wonderland, would be my elevator pitch. So it's a little girl who her family moves in this house, and she finds a small door, and the small door takes her into an alternate world where there's like other versions of people who creepily have buttons for eyeballs or buttons instead of eyes. And then things sort of escalate there into a dark fantasy adventure.
This is sounding familiar as I just watched this a few days ago.
Yes. One of the things that I think is interesting about Coraline from a story / thematic perspective, and I have watched this movie like several times in the last couple of weeks because my son ended up wanting to watch it. And when you have a small child, you don't really watch a movie from beginning to end. You watch like chunks of it in like random order. I thought, I mean, it's not great, but such is the parent life. One of the things that I thought was interesting about Coraline is it's ostensibly a horror movie, but told from the perspective of a kid. So a lot of the things in it are things that a child's imagination might turn into some kind of frightening or like horror scenario. Like, for example, finding a small door. If you go into old houses, sometimes you find weird doors in strange places. And the idea that this little door could take you to like an alternate world or like a nightmare world is like the kind of idea that a kid would come up with. And the idea that the other people have buttons for eyes, which makes them kind of resemble like life-size dolls. Again, I think the kind of idea that could come from a kid's mind, right? Like you're playing with dolls or you have like a doll family. But what if the doll family was alive or lived its own independent life, something like that?
One of the things that I appreciated about the film Coraline as a 34-year-old adult man who does not have children but is now watching a children's film was that I did not find there to be a lot of like moralizing in it, because it kind of starts with Coraline and her parents are like busy with their careers and what have you, and they're like sort of ignoring her, and she's all like, why are my dumb parents ignoring me? And I was kind of expecting that to turn into, a story about how her parents needed to pay more attention to their children and so on, which I feel like is something you see in a lot of children's movies where the ultimate message is that the parents need to stop worrying about how they're going to feed and clothe their children through their wage labor, but instead should lavish attention on their children. And the fact that it doesn't really become that, I thought was actually much to its benefit. It's like you said, it's primarily concerned with being a sort of horror fantasy adventure story, and it's not really concerned with trying to teach children like lessons about things. I mean, not that that isn't in there at all, but it definitely seems like it's more concerned with telling its own story and with sort of the visual creativity within that than with trying to teach, a lesson. Like we watched the movie Chicken Run, and Chicken Run very much tries to teach like, some basic like lessons, or has some basic like themes at heart about, believing in yourself and all that garbage. So I appreciated that Coraline was more concerned with just like telling a story.
Yeah, and one of the other things I thought was interesting, if you're talking about the parenting angle, so the parents are in it, and like you mentioned at the beginning, they're kind of ignoring her, but it doesn't turn into like it's the parents' fault for ignoring her or some other kind of simple message. And I liked that the other mother, who is ostensibly the villain, right? The other mother, has this kind of relationship that's like an abusive parent to a child because she lavishes attention on the kids and then at some point ends up neglecting and forgetting about them. So there's like an infatuation period, and then she kind of forgets about them and moves on. And there's a part at the end where the other mother, not at the exact end, but towards the end where the other mother says something to Coraline like, "Don't leave, I'll die without you," and like listen, she always tells her to like listen to your mother and stuff. It's kind of a relationship between an abusive parent and a child, but told through the lens of like a dark fantasy movie.
Yeah, it's like the Coraline gets kind of like what she wants, but then she realizes that having a parent who's like, primarily focused on lavishing you with attention at all times is actually not good for anyone, and that, maybe she might think that that's like what she wants, but in reality that is extremely unhealthy and not good.
Right. And we see the other kids that have been part of this process and they all eventually get discarded. If we want to talk about some of the visuals, the animation in it is great. Two of my favorite visual sequences is actually the very opening sequence where the other mother is creating the Coraline doll and like casting it into the future. So it's like this sequence where they bring in this other doll and it all feels very weird and macabre, but in a lot of ways it's just a doll, right? So we're just treating a doll the way that a doll would be treated, which is to take out the stuffing and put other kind of clothes and eyes on it. But there is kind of a horror movie element to it that makes it seem creepy. Like we imagine on some level that this is happening to a person, even though it is just happening to a doll. It's that kind of juxtaposition of children's elements and horror elements that I think make it kind of interesting. So that was one of my favorite sequences, is the very opening sequence, which I then did not really understand until seeing the whole movie all the way through. I don't know if you caught that or you remember this sequence I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I didn't get the full context, but then that doll appears in the movie shortly thereafter.
And the
And
doll that it starts as is one of the kids that she eventually meets. It's the doll of one of the previous children,
oh, okay, I didn't catch that then.
which is the great aunt of the kid that she meets, Wymie.
Right.
And then I also liked the mouse circus when she's in the other world.
Yeah, the jumping mice are pretty astounding to watch.
Yeah, and there's like even a POV shot of the jumping mice riding a ball down. So the jumping mice circus was pretty cool. I like the effect when she goes through the other door and there's like this camera pullback. It looks like the thing they do in Vertigo where they like zoom in and pull out at the same time,
Oh yeah.
where the background shifts but the foreground stays the same when she opens the door and like it like pulls all the way back. There's a lot of other interesting touches. Like, do you notice that the other mother, for example, and this is because I've ended up seeing this in bits and pieces a bunch of times, the other mother never eats food,
No, I guess I did not notice that.
which made me
Because
think of how in ghost stories you like trick people or get people to eat food as like a way of like drugging them or like getting them under your control. Because you'll notice the other mother never eats food. She makes food, right? She's always cooking, but she never eats any of it. And then you kind of notice too that the other characters in that world are all made out of inanimate objects, like specific inanimate objects. Like the other father is a pumpkin, for example.
I don't know if I noticed that either.
Yeah, so there's a lot of fun like visual touches throughout.
You know, I think when you're talking about that opening sequence, it shows how well this movie is suited to the form of stop motion animation because, you know, the dolls and the characters themselves are sort of like of the same materials and of the same world. Whereas if this was like a live action film and you saw someone like stuffing a doll, it wouldn't have the same effect. But the fact that these like live action figures are essentially like dolls in and of themselves, like moving throughout this, you know, constructed world, I think like it shows that this was a good. I mean, I haven't read the original thing, but I think it just is a good demonstration that this is a good match of material to medium in terms of stop motion animation. And I was going to say I also really enjoyed the jumping mice circus. That was a pretty visually astounding feat of like stop motion animation. And you know, in general, I think like for me, I think the most fascinating parts of this film are when Coraline is exploring the nooks and crannies of the, you know, other world where there's like this garden, and then she goes to the downstairs neighbors who are like the old actresses, and then she goes to the upstairs neighbor where there's like the dancing mice. Like to me, that was kind of like the most fascinating parts of this world where you get to see the visual imagination of all these like wild things. And then I think once we sort of got around to, this is a common thing, once you sort of get around to the explanation and then how we're gonna stop it, it kind of became like slightly less interesting to me. Though I will say that I was actually kind of surprised at the fact that I did find myself like actually really getting into the story of this, because I know I've previously said that I am dead inside instead of having an inner child. So normally I'm like, I don't understand how adults can watch children's movies, but for the most part, I found Coraline to be pretty effective. But like I said, if they get around to explaining it, it kind of takes away some of the magic. So once we got into the full, like, here's what's going on and here's what we need to do going forward to, like, you know, resolve the plot and save the world or whatever, like, then it became a little bit, like, less interesting to me. But overall, I was surprised at how, you know, effective it was, not just in the wonderful animation, but in the actual story itself.
I did like as the movie got closer to the climax, the visual styling of the other world starts to evolve a bit and it becomes more insect based. And of course, the other mother sort of evolves into her other forms.
Yeah.
And I
And
like that. And that switches it up a little because you think you know what the other world looks like, and then you realize, of course, that it's mostly either constructs or tricks or illusions of some kind.
Yeah, and the villain of the film is actually pretty effectively creepy.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing I think that's almost more creepy to adults, maybe because like my son was watching it and he was just kind of like, oh, okay, whatever. And then I'm watching and you're kind of thinking about the idea of like a spider that's like made out of needles is kind of unsettling.
Yeah, and I mean of being trapped in like a giant spider web with a giant spider who wants to like eat your soul.
Yeah, and she's like literally made out of needles or sewing needles or something.
Yeah.
Seems to be what she's made out of. I also liked the fact that
Well, I mean, if you just think about like taking out someone's eyes and replacing them with buttons, or like literally sewing someone's mouth shut, which are things that in the film, it is not like a huge deal to literally do to like a stop motion doll figure. But when you think about them as characters and as people, like literally sewing someone's mouth shut is like pretty horrifying.
yeah, or like you said, removing someone's eyeballs and putting in buttons instead.
Yeah. It's like a thing of like, oh, it's like a doll with eyes, or like it's a stop motion figure with eyes. But then when you actually think about it, yes, it's actually somewhat horrifying.
Yeah. And there's moments like that too, where there's a part in the film where she loses her parents and she has to like put herself to bed. I mean, I found that a little affecting. Maybe as a parent, I guess. Dustin didn't care. He's like, oh, whatever.
Yeah, I was like, whatever, I don't care. I said, I'm not a parent, so I don't care. I said that out loud.
Yeah, to the movie.
In my empty apartment.
Yeah. So yeah, I actually thought it was a really good movie. In the sense it's a dark fantasy. It sort of definitely combines these childhood frightening things with more adult concepts of horror, like we were kind of talking about, in sort of an interesting little mixture. And then of course the animation is extremely well done, and there's a lot of really great visual sequences with that.
Yeah, I sometimes find myself skeptical of these children's films that seem to be beloved by adults as well, but I thought that this one was actually pretty good.
Maybe this is wrong, but I was trying to find if do you remember that when the other father sings her a song at the piano?
I do remember that. It sounded like They Might Be Giants.
Yes. I was trying to look up if that actually was They Might Be Giants doing the song, and I couldn't really find it, but it might be. I don't know.
Yeah, and unlike a lot of other children's films too, there aren't a lot of like songs for no reason. There is a little singing, but it's fun.
Yeah. So I thought Coraline, I almost called it Caroline. Coraline.
Yeah, you don't want to do that.
Was a very effective movie.
Is this the best children's film that you've watched with your son?
That I've been exposed to by having kids? It could be. I mean, the other candidates are not real strong. I don't want to like dump on kids movies that are legitimately meant to be watched by kids, because obviously that's a very different audience. I don't want to judge the success of a kids movie, off of whether an adult finds it entertaining, because I guess the intended audience is children. I mean, Coraline is an interesting example because I think it can be enjoyed equally by both children and adults for somewhat different reasons, which is a very hard balance to strike, and I think they do it successfully. I have seen a bunch of other, kids movies that I wouldn't necessarily recommend to adults, but I mean, my son seems to like them, so I guess that makes them good movies, makes them good kids movies.
I suppose he's the actual target audience.
I thought of another good visual sequence when they're at the dinner table and the little gravy train comes out.
Oh yeah, I was thinking like that would be sweet to have a literal gravy train.
Yeah. It's that stuff that also would not be as impressive as you say in live action. Something about it being in this sort of animation, the stop motion with like these little POV shots is great.
I was also a fan of the Great Bobinsky.
Yeah.
It's kind of fun, like this Russian acrobat character.
Yeah.
So I think we're in agreement. Coraline, it's good. I believe next we are going to talk about a comic book entitled Flight of the Raven by Jean Pierre Gibrat. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is correct.
So, Matt, would you like to tell the people what this comic book is about?
Flight of the Raven is a young woman who is caught up in the French resistance during the very tail end of the Second World War. If Canal was a World War II resistance movie by way of Heart of Darkness and A Descent into the Underworld. And the movie I recommend with that, Army of Shadows, was sort of a World War II resistance story through the lens of a gangster movie. This is the story of another World War II resistance movement told through a lens of slice of life and like an Italian neorealism almost, because a lot of the major war events are happening in the background and the characters kind of learn about them through the news. And it's not really concerned with grand heroic gestures. It's a lot of people just sort of trying to figure out what to do and looking for, like, the main plot is that she's trying to find her sister, and we really don't know what happened to the sister. She may or may not have been arrested.
To find that out, you have to read the companion volume.
Oh, is there a sequel? Is this only what part of a thing?
So there's a book, called The Reprieve, which is starring the sister.
Oh, okay.
And this is, I think, was published afterwards and is starring the other sister. So he's written done several comics. So this is like half of a story that was sort of referenced in this other book, which I didn't know until after I read it, and which you don't really need to know while reading it.
Right.
Though I would say that comparing it to an Italian neorealist film does not feel quite accurate to me, because this is not like excessively like gritty kind of thing, because for better or for worse, it's definitely kind of like cheesecakey, and it's very like pastorally beautiful in a way that I don't think is bad at all, and it's probably the main appeal of this comic. But it never really truly feels like you're in some sort of like life or death struggle for life and for human dignity with like the jackboots on the throat kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true. There's a romantic sense to it, and the art is this sort of realistic painted watercolor style. Like, there are crowd scenes that you could use for like postcards.
Yeah, the art in this comic book is pretty astounding. I think it's just like so incredibly beautiful. Like, there's these pages that just have these scenes of Paris. Like, there's in one part she's hiding out on a boat, one of the barges in the Paris canals, and like scenes in like the French countryside and stuff. And it's just so wonderful. And you mentioned it is in perhaps a bit of like a realist mode, but there's also sort of like these moody like watercolors, and the lines can be sometimes somewhat loose, but the main character is, and I am 95% sure that this is not, well, no, let's say I'm completely sure that this is not an accident, that the main character is a beautiful young woman who always looks wonderful and whose clothes occasionally come off. I was not surprised to read in the afterword that this artist had previously worked in erotic comic books.
Yeah.
Because there's definitely, like I said, a bit of like a cheesecake kind of thing going on with this like beautiful young woman in the French Resistance, which is not bad at all. In fact, I mean, I think that the wonderful, like warm, like visual appeal of this like beautiful art is probably the main reason to read this, as the story is like fine, but even though it is like literally like a life and death story, and even when like the Germans are like right near her, like searching, it never really like gets the heart pumping as far as like somebody's could about to die,
Yeah, I guess that's where I was thinking of the realism angle, because the main characters, even though it is World War II resistance, the main characters are not like heroic figures. There's a lot of time spent of them just kind of like waiting around to see what's going to happen, which is probably a more realistic view of what being on the run from the Germans is like, right? Because you're not shooting it out with them and like stashing their bodies. It's a lot of just waiting around to see if the police are going to come find you, sort of a thing.
Yeah, and like leaving messages for other people, and trying to meet people in public and seeing if they show up, and then trying to figure out what to do. Yeah, I mean, that's true. It's definitely not aiming for like a like actiony, like badass kind of thing. It's more quotidian, like day to day. Um,
Yeah. Slice of life to some degree, as you mentioned, the sort of soft focus art.
yeah, there's definitely like a sort of slice of life quality as there's a big chunk of the book where she's hiding out on this barge, and you do get a sense of like the day-to-day life of like this like family that lives on this like barge in the French canals. Did you like the comic book The Flight of the Raven?
I did like it. I thought one of the other things that was interesting was the idea that they're in the resistance, but like I said, they're not really heroic. They're just kind of trying to avoid the police. And the Allied bombing campaigns are, in fact, quite dangerous, even for people who are opposed to the Germans, right? Because you've got planes and bombs and machine guns and stuff. So it's kind of a dangerous, chaotic time, which is probably what it would have been like to be in, an occupied area. Like you're excited for the Allies to come, but they're bombing things. There's fires. There's a part where there's a plane with machine gunning.
They get strafed by some English fighter planes.
It's a perspective very specifically of like a ground level French perspective and not any other perspective. There's no perspective towards the other allies or from the Germans or anything like that. In fact, there's really no German characters. The only German character is a soldier who's in the German army who is from, I believe he's from Alsace-Lorraine, meaning he is ostensibly German, but when he was growing up, it would have been part of France.
But
And that's the
ethnically
close,
German.
right. That's the closest thing to like a German soldier we have. I mean, he is a German soldier, but um, even in that, it's like a French German soldier or Franco German, if that's a thing.
But didn't you just want to like in these like scenes of Paris and the French countryside, didn't you want to just like step into them and walk around?
Yeah,
Even
take a
though it's like
leisurely nap under a tree.
even though it's like under occupation by the fascist army.
Yeah. You know what's interesting is looking through this, I feel like you can almost read this without the text. I feel like you could basically remove all of the text from the story. And that's not meant to be a slight on the story. I think it shows you both how good the art is and how effective it is to actually telling the story. Like, I don't know, would you agree? I think you could literally erase all the captions from this and still basically read it and get the effect of it and still understand more or less what's happening.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair to say, and in kind of the best way, in the sense that Jean Pierre Gibrat, or JPG as his friends may very well call him, is a really beautiful artist, and like you get the sense from like the acting and the facial expressions of the characters and the designs of the characters exactly like who they are and what's going on like every page. It's pretty, and it's like on a visual level, which I suppose is the primary level that a comic book operates on. I think it's a pretty astounding piece of work. Like right here, I'm looking at a half-page depiction of this barge on the canal, and like you can see this reflection in the water of these buildings, and the watercolors of the buildings, and that are kind of like impressionistic, and there's some trees and shadows, and it's just so goddamn pretty is what it is.
Yeah, no, the art is beautiful. And like you said, there's a beautiful, dare I say, sexy lady as the main character, which
Yeah,
is meant to be part of the charm.
right. It's like this beautiful young girl who's actually a communist in the resistance,
Yeah,
and the story starts with her in prison, and then this other guy is in prison, and then they escape and are like hiding out. But it's interesting because she's almost somewhat of a passive character, at least in the first half, because she like hurts her ankle. So the classic like feminine injury in a story is the twisted ankle. So she's like sort of partially incapacitated, and I don't know that it ever really hurts the story, because as we were kind of saying, this is not like a story about heroic like badasses single-handedly holding off the German army. It's a story of a couple people in Paris right before it gets liberated, hiding out from the crowds,
on a barge that's floating slowly down the river.
and sometimes being sexy while doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was good. I think the art is definitely the strong point. Like I said, you could basically look through it without even reading the captions. And gain an appreciation for, I think, everything that's happening here, both in the terms of the depictions and the just the storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, but I mean, I definitely think this comic is worth picking up. I was not familiar with this guy's other work, including his erotic version of Pinocchio, which I have not read and probably won't read, but I definitely think like some of his other war comics would be sort of fascinating to pick up. I mean, this is a case where I think the visual beauty and the visual styling in all ways, from like the soft focus pastoral beauty of the settings to the character designs and the what you could call the acting of the characters themselves, is also wonderfully like rendered and so powerful in telling the story, that like you said, the actual prose styling at hand is fine, and it's enough to to carry you along. And even though the story will never get your like blood pumping for you know life or death, for the life or death stakes, I think it's still really really a really wonderful little book. Don't you think, Matt?
Oh, I agree. I felt there is a scene where the German soldier is trying to attack her. I felt that was a little weird.
That was definitely a little like cheesecakey, where she's like her like shirt is open.
Yeah, I felt that was a little unnecessary.
Yeah,
A little that made me feel a little icky.
there was, yeah, that sequence I think kind of veers a little, maybe a little over the line into like pervy, which is, it kind of seems like it's always perhaps like always threatening to do. Yeah, I get what you mean. I mean, that sort of like cheesecakey beautiful lady drawings is definitely part of what's going on here and is part of the appeal, and that scene is maybe where it goes a little bit too far in indulging that.
I guess my last thought would just be that it makes a very interesting counterpoint to something like Canal that we watched a couple weeks ago, both about World War II resistance fighters. Very different types of story, because Canal is like this heart of darkness, descent into the underworld. We're trudging through chest waste human sewage to escape the people trying to incinerate everyone.
Whereas
And this,
this is like, what if you were a beautiful lady hiding out in gay Paris?
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, two things could not share a subject matter and be more diametrically opposite in terms of approach. Because Canal is literally like, we're all gonna die and we're in hell. And this is like, not that at all. Like, we're in heaven and, we might die, but it sure is pretty out here. I guess there's still a threat of death, but you never really, like, I never really felt like the life or death stakes in this comic. But I wasn't necessarily bothered by that because I had such a pleasant time reading it.
yeah. Better to die in Paris than live in the Polish sewers, I guess.
Yeah, that might be fair to say. I know which place I would rather go on a vacation to.
Right. Well, do you have a recommendation for us this week, Mr. Dustin?
For a recommendation, I might mention another stop motion animated film that is done by, well, actually, maybe two stop motion animated films. One that came out a few years ago, which I really love, is called Anomalisa, and it is written and co-directed by Charlie Kaufman. And it is about basically a guy who's at like a work conference, and I won't really like spoil it, but he then undergoes this sort of like existential crisis, and it's definitely not like a animated film for children. It's very much like this serious examination of like the meaning of life in this one like sort of character's worldview. But I thought it was pretty amazing. But there's another film made by the same studio that did Coraline, Leica, and they've done quite a few really good stop motion animated films. But one they did a while ago called Kubo and the Two Strings, I thought was really fun. It's kind of set in the Japanese countryside, and it's about this little boy who has to go off on this adventure, but it has a lot of like really wonderful character designs. Like there's a giant stop motion dragon with all these like moving parts, and these other kind of characters, like a giant beetle and stuff. It's definitely less of like a, deeper like horror fantasy kind of thing like Coraline, and more of just like a rollicking adventure. But it's got a lot of, really wonderful characters and stuff. It's a pretty good time. I enjoyed it. What about you, Matt?
My recommendation for this is another movie. This is a live action movie that is adapted from a Neil Gaiman comic, which has Robert De Niro as a cross-dressing pirate captain. Have you seen this movie? Do you know what movie I'm talking about?
I have seen this movie. It's called Stardust.
Yeah, I was going to recommend that as another adaptation, another good adaptation, I think, of Neil Gaiman. It has been a while since I've seen it. It just kind of made me think of it while watching Coraline. And I don't know enough about classy European comics to recommend something that ties into that better, because I'm uncultured and uneducated.
How many degrees do you have?
Well, technically I have 2, but they're both bachelors, so I don't think that adds up to anything. That just means that I should have only gone to college once for the first time.
Don't you have a bachelor's in philosophy and film studies and a teaching degree?
Yeah.
Okay. So you're not uneducated, you're just uncultured.
I'm uncultured in fancy pants European comics, which we also discussed when we watched Equinoxes, or read Equinoxes.
That's true. It's a big wide world out there.
Yeah.
And sometimes there are films adapted from Neil Gaiman, and I guess there's nothing we can do about that.
Well, that's the through line there. See, I wanted a through line for the recommendation.
No, I got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was, yeah.
I remember it being okay. It's a Matthew Vaughn film. He's kind of a schmuck, in my opinion, but...
Yeah, I don't know if he's ever done anything that I would consider super great.
But hey, Stardust's better than a kick in the teeth.
It's better than getting run over by a pack of wild buffalo.
You don't have to say that again.
Well, that is technically our show.
Thank God. It's over.
Finally over with. We are on the internet at armyofcrime.com. I am on Twitter at armyofcrime. Dustin is at Dustin with a bunch of 4s.
Yeah, it's at DUSTIN 44444.
Okay. That's very solid and easy to remember.
I mean, I don't know. It's stupid. I agree.
Leave us a review on whatever app you're using. So if you're listening right now, and you are, if you can hear this, you can leave us a 5-star review. Shoot us any comments on Twitter or on the website if you want to tell me how dumb and uneducated I am. If you want to recommend me more European comics, you could feel free. I'm sure Dustin could as well. But it is a gaping hole in my comics knowledge that I am aware of.
Gross.
Remember, kids, no matter how nice they seem, don't let anyone take out your eyeballs and replace them with buttons. Viva la resistance.
Viva la resistance.